Hey guys, I got a couple of family things coming up this week, and so we're not going to be doing our usual Saturday morning banter that we record the day before. And because there's so much going on this week, there has been so much critical news. I just wanted to hop on for a few minutes and share some thoughts about all of that. Let's start with this $1.8 billion slush fund. This is a settlement that Donald Trump has made with the IRS and the Treasury Department over his $10 billion lawsuit, which stems from his complaint about having his tax returns leaked. This slush fund, which is called the Anti-Weaponization Fund, the pretext is that the money is going to go to people who have been wronged by the government. Well, that's just bullshit. Okay, what's happening here is that Donald Trump is going to be rewarding his allies, presumably most of them criminals, presumably January 6th rioters, who stand to make about $1 million each in payoffs. Now, let's just think about this for a second. This is taxpayer money. Taxpayer money going to be going to people who were convicted in a court of law by a jury of their peers in front of a judge based on evidence. This is not lawfare. This is just how the judicial system works. You may not like it when somebody who is loyal to you gets convicted and sent to prison, but that doesn't make it lawfare. It doesn't make it unjust, and it certainly doesn't make these people victims. And so what we're dealing with here at the end of the day is the message that's being sent by the President of the United States to future rioters, future insurrectionists, that if you do what I want you to do, not only am I going to pardon you and give you a get-out-of-jail-free card, I'm going to pay you. There's money in this for you. Let that sink in. The people who would be getting these payments would be determined by a 5-person commission appointed by Donald Trump. Surprise, surprise. So the whole thing is just so damn corrupt. I mean, when you think about that, the President of the United States sued agencies that he controls and then dictated to them how to settle these cases, which benefit him personally and his family members personally. Like, how could this be legal, right? Because nothing gets done without Donald Trump's marching orders. Just think about the corruption here, the self-dealing, the conflicts of interest, and think about how unprecedented and unconscionable that is. 2 of the cops that were attacked on January 6, 2021, Harry Dunn of the U.S. Capitol Police and Officer Daniel Hodges of Washington's Metro Police Force, they're suing. Democrats are also suing. So there's a few lawsuits that are already starting to be filed, and I'm sure there's going to be more. And the question then becomes, as Congressman Jamie Raskin, who is the ranking minority member on the House Judiciary Committee, and he himself a constitutional law scholar, he's called this slush fund illegal and unconstitutional. It's illegal because the money wasn't appropriated by Congress. And then he's also citing a clause in the Constitution that says you can't give money to people who committed acts of insurrection or rebellion. And just logically thinking, rationally thinking, how can this be legal? And then you couple it with the other part of the settlement deal, which is the Justice Department granting Trump, his family, his businesses, his trusts, immunity from ongoing inquiries into their taxes. The government would be, quote, forever barred and precluded from prosecuting or pursuing pending tax claims against Trump and his family members and businesses for anything prior to the confirmation of this deal yesterday, May 18th. So that doesn't necessarily preclude the government in the future, let's say under a Democratic presidential administration, or if the Democrats take control of Congress, it doesn't stop them from going after Trump and his family members and his businesses if there's some shady shit that took place after May 18th, 2026. There's also a federal law that prohibits Trump from instructing the IRS to start or stop specific audits. But there's a carve-out for the Attorney General. In this case, acting Attorney General Todd Blanche. Now, is there anyone on this planet who thinks Todd Blanche went off and did all this without the marching orders from Donald Trump? But I guess litigants being able to prove something like that in court might be the challenge. The question, though, is here's a guy who says he has nothing to hide with the Epstein scandal, but refuses to release the full Epstein files. And we've had no prosecutions of any pedophiles. So what's he hiding? Here's a guy who claims his tax returns are beautiful, perfect, that he pays all his taxes. He still, over the years, has yet to release his tax returns and now cut this deal for himself. What's he hiding with his tax returns? Why do you need this deal? Why do you need immunity if you are completely operating legally and above board with your businesses and your trusts and in your personal life? Donald Trump stands to benefit by not having the IRS continue to go after him for the reported $100 million he could have ended up paying the government over his tax return issues. Blanche went before Congress this week and testified, and he was specifically asked by Democratic congressmen, can you rule out today in front of us anyone who attacked police officers on January 6th? Can you rule out them being able to apply for and receiving any money from this fund? He refused to answer that question. He could not say no. You would think that's a simple question, right? A very easy one to answer no with. Cops get beat up by Joe Blow. Joe Blow shouldn't be able to get money as a quote-unquote victim from January 6th. And by the way, J.D. Vance, Vice President J.D. Vance yesterday was speaking, and this is how this administration is continuing to try to rewrite history. He referred to what happened on January 6th as the J6 protests. So anybody who was victimized in the J6 protests could apply and get money out of this slush fund. Now it's a protest, not an insurrection attempt, not an attempt to overthrow the government or overturn an election. There are people who believe that Todd Blanche lied under oath this week when he claims that he met with Epstein survivors. Immediately, the Epstein survivors put out a press release saying he didn't meet with us. He didn't meet with any of us. That's a lie. He's lied under oath. Moving along on the corruption train is the news that came out from Trump's own disclosures this week that he is making a fortune on incredibly unethical and perhaps illegal stock trades. 3,700 trades in the first quarter, 59 trades a day average, 9 trades per hour average, for a cumulative value of between $220 million and $750 million. And you know what? All the people who are complaining for the last several years about Nancy Pelosi and her insider trading and blah, 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 not a peep out of these people. Just another thing that Donald Trump gets to do without any accountability, without any pushback or action from Congress, from Republican Congress people. The corruption is on a scale that is off the charts. And in looking at the election that's coming up in November, Trump came out and endorsed Ken Paxton for senator in Texas over John Cornyn, who's been a senator forever. And what has Cornyn's crime been? He just doesn't kiss Donald Trump's ass 24/7, although he's done a pretty good job doing it most of the time. In fact, recently, I think he named a highway in Texas after Trump, only to have Trump endorse Paxton. But this might be fun for Trump, and it might be fun for MAGA. Yeah, revenge against John Cornyn. But it just made it that much easier for the Democrat, James Tallarico, to flip the seat in Texas. Because Paxton has a history of unethical and allegations of corrupt behavior, and he's MAGA, and there's a reason why Tallarico has been popular in Texas. And so this could actually be the year where Texas finally turns purple or blue. So I say more, please. Donald Trump loves to primary people, loves to have his people, his candidates win in primaries, but they typically have a really hard time winning in the general election. And so without Trump actually on the ballot himself this November, we're going to see a test here of just how much his influence and his weight carries in the midterms, where a president typically gets shellacked in his first midterm. And when you look at Trump's overall popularity right now, which is at its lowest at 37%, where he's lost independent voters, he's lost Hispanic voters, he's lost Gen Z, he's even starting to lose his bread and butter non-college white voters. It's really hard to imagine that he's helping himself, let alone the destruction he's single-handedly doing to the Republican Party for November. It's hard to imagine that he's helping the cause by endorsing people like Ken Paxton. The other big news this week was last night, Kentucky Rep. Thomas Massie, another foe of Trump, was primaried, and he lost. So he's got 7 months left or whatever to serve, and then he's out. And what was his crime? His crime was fighting for the Epstein survivors, fighting for accountability and justice, fighting for the release of the Epstein files, fighting for prosecutions. You know, all the things Donald Trump promised MAGA that he would do if he became president again. And suspiciously, now that he's president again, he's fighting like an animal to keep all that shit secret. We still have half of the files that haven't been released, 3 million files. And where are the prosecutions? Todd Blanche said there's not even any investigations taking place. There's no one to prosecute. So if I was a Kentucky voter in I think the 4th district, and I had a choice between Massie and Trump's handpicked primary candidate, I'd say, why does Trump hate Massie so much for what he's done on Epstein? Ask yourselves that question. Why would he? Think about it. The answer is not that complicated. But here's the thing. Epstein is not going away. The Epstein shitstorm is not going away. It's a giant fucking boulder that's rolling down a hill. Trump is trying whatever he can to run out of its way, but it is eventually going to flatten him. And keep your eyes on Thomas Massie. He's got, like I said, till the end of the year to do lots of things to fight for justice and accountability for the Epstein survivors, including standing on the floor of the House and reading off the names of all the pedophiles mentioned in the Epstein files. And I bet you he's going to do that. Another Trump opponent who was primaried and lost was Louisiana Senator Bill Cassidy. Bill Cassidy, who was the deciding vote in confirming Bobby Kennedy Jr. as Secretary of Health and Human Services. Now, what was his crime? Even after kissing Trump's ass and rubber stamping Kennedy's confirmation, he voted to convict Trump in the impeachment trial, along with a few other Republicans. Trump never forgets that. Never forgets that shit. And by the way, if you're a Republican voter, if you're a MAGA voter, one of the things you really need to ask yourselves is, when Donald Trump endorses somebody and tells me to vote for them, is he endorsing them because that candidate is actually going to serve my interests or Donald Trump's interests? That's also a question that's not too difficult to answer. But Cassidy's had the last laugh because this week, after unsuccessfully trying about 8 times in Congress to vote to stop funding the war in Iran, Democrats who have failed all those times, guess what? Cassidy voted with them this week. And he voted to advance a resolution that would force Trump to end the hostilities in Iran or go to Congress to seek authorization. Going forward, this measure will allow the issue to be debated now and receive a full vote in the coming weeks. We also saw another one of Trump's empty threats come and go this week. You know, when the Iranian leadership sees Trump go, you better open that strait or else, I'm sure they're just rolling on the floor laughing. Because how many of his threats have come and gone without him doing anything? When I see them, they're so pathetic. Last thing I want to mention with relating to Bobby Kennedy is there are serious concerns now about the Ebola virus, the hantavirus. We have a measles outbreak. I don't know about you guys, but I'm damn glad we have Bobby Kennedy Jr. in charge of all this shit, right? Fauci schmouchy. We got Bobby. We're going to be just fine. And I want to end on a lighter and happier note. My New York Knicks last night came back from like a 22-point deficit. It was the second greatest comeback in NBA playoffs history to beat the Cleveland Cavaliers in Game 1 of the Eastern Conference Finals. And I am just fucking thrilled. Knicks are going all the way. All right, we are now going to give you the regularly scheduled episode, which is a conversation with author and historian Jonathan Jordan. So check that out. Here it is. Hey, everybody. Welcome into the back room. I'm Andy Ostroy. We have author Jonathan Jordan with us today. We'll chat with him in just a moment. First, thanks for tuning in. We appreciate you listening, and we'd love to hear your comments. So email us at backroomandy@gmail.com and or post on our social media, and we'll read some feedback next time. And if you like the podcast, please rate and review and follow or subscribe, and you'll be notified every time we post a new episode. So Jonathan Jordan is a historian and an award-winning author of 5 books, including the New York Times bestseller, Brothers, Rivals, Victors, Eisenhower, Patton, Bradley, and the Partnership That Drove the Allied Conquest in Europe. He is a regular book critic for the Wall Street Journal and the author of nearly 24 articles appearing in MHQ, the Quarterly Journal of Military History, World War II Magazine, Military History, and World War II History Magazine. He has made numerous live, televised podcast and radio appearances, and he's with us today to discuss his new book, Ike and Winston, World War, Cold War, and an Extraordinary Friendship. Jonathan, welcome into the back room.
Andy, thanks for having me today.
So congrats on the new book, Ike and Winston, World War, Cold War, and an Extraordinary Friendship. You've written extensively about war and military history. What inspired you to write this book about Dwight D. Eisenhower and Winston Churchill?
Well, Andy, I've always been interested in people who are extremely smart, extremely talented, and good at what they do, who can get together and work in pairs or in teams. Sometimes the folks who are highly talented people have high egos. They have difficulty functioning together. They can't set aside their personal and professional differences. But Ike and Winston were 2 people who managed to set aside some differences in background, differences in class, and were able to work together for the common good. And this is a great example in how somebody who is foreign to you, literally and figuratively, can work with you and become your best friend.
Mm-hmm. What drew you most to this relationship between Eisenhower and Churchill? Was it the personalities, the stakes of the moment, or something about the dynamic between them?
Well, the personalities, of course, are bigger than life. Winston Churchill and Dwight Eisenhower, we've all got kind of a mental picture of them. But I think what pulled me into this story was the way that they managed to keep their friendship intact despite not only big differences from where they started, but differences from where they ended. The characters came full circle to each other. And we can talk a little bit about how America leapfrogged over the British Empire, about how Eisenhower started as a lowly staff officer, a brigadier with no brigade, and became the head of state. Churchill began the war as an anti-communist who became a friend with Joseph Stalin out of convenience, then an anti-communist, then someone who was passionate about finding a way to bridge the gap between Washington and Moscow and create peace. Eisenhower went from being the great conciliator and cooperator between the Allies during World War II to becoming a hardcore anti-communist in the 1950s who was very reluctant to trust his former allies. So these 2 went in a complete circle in many ways, but the one thing that remained constant was their respect and affection for each other.
Mm-hmm. Well, Churchill was the seasoned statesman, Eisenhower the rising military leader. Eisenhower was steady and understated. Churchill was bold and strategic. Ike was an early bird. Churchill, a hard-drinking and smoking night owl. How did that imbalance, those differences, shape their decision-making and trust in each other?
Well, those were part of the personality differences that I think they both concluded we've just got to live with. Now, of course, at the very beginning and throughout probably late 1944, Eisenhower was the one who had to do most of the getting along. Churchill had been set in his ways. He was the prime minister of the British Empire. And when he wanted to work, he summoned his generals. When he wanted to sleep or have dinner or what have you, then he politely dismissed them. Eisenhower had to change a lot of his habits, a lot of his impressions, both to get along with his other British peers as well as Churchill. Now, towards the last half of their partnership during World War II, Ike became more independent, and he began to make set some boundaries. At one point in early 1944, he told Churchill, if you want to begin a meeting and it's after 9:30, you're going to have to do it without me because I've got to get up in the morning. I've got to work with my staff, and I just can't keep going on that way. That was a change from the Eisenhower of 1942, who would show up back in London with what I call Churchill hangovers from staying up till 2 or 3 in the morning with Churchill talking about strategy, talking about the war, and so on. Mm-hmm. One thing I did note, though, after a lot of those late night sessions was that Churchill drank and smoked a lot less than people thought. He would have a whiskey and soda or some other drink. His family members said they were so watered down, if you got one at a bar, you'd send it back. He would sip on it, he would hold it in his hand, and he would talk. With his other hand, he would have a cigar, but he might smoke that cigar up for 4 or 5 hours. He would let it go out. He would talk some more. He would ostentatiously relight the cigar and puff away a little bit and then just hold it till it went out. Those were the kind of things that he liked to use as props to sort of dominate a room. They were his brand. And Eisenhower didn't have that kind of brand. Ike was just willing to go along with Churchill, but eventually assert himself.
We touched on this just a little bit before, but like when you really dig into their partnership, obviously on many levels it was smooth and unified, but talk a little bit more about the tension, the underlying tension that existed between the two of us that may have impacted their working relationship at times.
Oh, after the war, Eisenhower said that he had such great affection for Churchill. He believed Churchill was one of the greatest men he knew personally in his lifetime. But he said, this is despite the fact that we argued a lot. And they argued over strategy in World War II. They argued over the Mediterranean, about North Africa. Ike was the first one who did not want to go to North Africa. And in fact, set out the original memo stating the American position that if the British insisted on going into North Africa, we ought to scrap the Germany first approach that we had agreed on with the British and go off into the Pacific and clean things up with Japan first. They disagreed about the invasion of southern France, the so-called Anvil landings, later called Dragoon. They disagreed after the war about nuclear weapons, about how to handle Moscow, but they were always able to keep their personal relationships and their policy differences separate. And that lasted throughout their lifetime. Remember, Churchill was British Prime Minister from 1951 to 1955. That overlapped with Eisenhower's presidency, which began in January 1953. And so in addition to the famous disputes they had over whether to take Berlin, whether to take Prague, their Iron Curtain differences, they differed over post-war subjects like Vietnam, like the Suez Canal, like Iran or Guatemala. So there were plenty of areas where duty required these two friends to disagree, but they always managed to keep duty and friendship separately. And that's something that we don't see very much these days, where ideology kind of drives a friendship or an enmity. Mm-hmm. These gentlemen were of a sort who never wanted to let a good friendship get ruined by policy.
Let's talk about Berlin for a second. That was a big source of disagreement and tension between the two of them. Hindsight, of course, being a luxury. Was it a huge mistake, as Churchill thought it was, for Eisenhower not to take Berlin?
Well, of course, with hindsight, we're all much smarter than we were
Right.
than the people were at the time. And I tried to write the book only looking at what they knew at the time. Eisenhower at the time saw Berlin as a prestige target, a place where he would lose probably, according to Omar Bradley, about 100,000 casualties. And his orders from the combined chiefs of staff were to destroy the German army and its ability to resist effectively. He looked at things from a military perspective, and to him, Berlin was a terrible military decision. The German here, our army, wasn't polishing their medals on the Brandenburg Gate. They were out in central Germany, and that's where Eisenhower felt, as a military man, he should go. Well, Winston Churchill, of course, had to look through a much broader lens. He looked through the lens of his role as Minister of Defense, and therefore he had a military role. But he also had to think about the post-war world and the political world. And as he saw it, and he wrote passionately to Eisenhower, he wrote passionately to FDR, and some of the last letters FDR received before his death, that if we let the Russians take Berlin, won't they believe that they've done the bulk of the fighting and they will demand the lion's share of the spoils at the peace table? So Churchill had to look at things from a political standpoint. Eisenhower insisted his military judgment was correct, but would tell Churchill, if you believe politics overrides my military decisions, then it's your duty to go to the president and work this out.
Were there other moments where their relationship nearly broke down? And what does that tell us about leadership under extreme pressure back then? And of course, things are much different today.
Probably the most passionate arguments they had were over the invasion of southern France. This was something that Franklin Roosevelt had promised to Stalin at the Tehran conference, and Eisenhower thought that an invasion of southern France would be a good way of adding a new supply line, adding the ability to support another army group, broadening the war. Eisenhower was a lot like Ulysses Grant in the Civil War in his approach of, if we've got more resources, we should steamroll the enemy from every direction we can. Churchill, for his part, saw the Anvil invasion as a way of taking away from the effort to drive up the Italian boot, which was a British-led operation, and it would really do nothing to help Eisenhower. Originally, the concept of an invasion of southern France was, we'll do that as a diversion right before D-Day. And the way it worked out, they had to make the invasion basically 2.5 months after D-Day. So it didn't really help the Normandy invasions. It just sapped strength from the British theater. And Churchill was bitterly disappointed about that. Eisenhower's naval aide, who kept a diary, Harry Butcher, said that when Churchill insisted, Eisenhower said no in every form of the English language he knew. And it got to the point where Churchill did something extraordinary. He misrepresented what Eisenhower had said. And after a talk in early August 1944, Churchill began sending letters to Washington, to the British chiefs who were over there, and to Roosevelt, referring to new differences of opinion here, or new opinions here, that we need to change the plans for southern France. And then he wrote to Eisenhower afterward, disingenuously, saying, I told the president about your idea about changing the invasion from southern France and moving it around to western France into Brittany. And Eisenhower was horrified. He couldn't believe Churchill would say this. He wrote immediately to George Marshall and said, I have no idea where the prime minister got this, but I've never changed my view on the need for the Anvil landings. And so the tension there was probably at its worst. Churchill used every form of persuasion he could with Eisenhower. He had tears rolling down his cheeks. He talked of his need to go to the king and resign his office. He tried to bully. He tried to pout. He pressed on their personal friendship. He did everything he could. But Eisenhower just said no. And by that point, Ike's military judgment was so highly respected by the American chiefs of staff that Churchill knew that he couldn't fire Ike and he couldn't overrule him. So he just had to fight and do what he could. And Churchill held that grudge, among others, for a very long time. And when Churchill famously wrote his Second World War memoirs, some of those volumes came out during Eisenhower's presidency. And in the edits and rewrites to chapters, he had to be careful to go back in and scrub some of those, the language in those drafts, referring to mistakes the Americans had made. Mm-hmm. And those mistakes were basically on Eisenhower's shoulders.
Mm-hmm. And with regard to the Soviet Union, talk about the long peace.
This was something that was interesting because it was in many ways shaped by the Eisenhower-Churchill relationship. Eisenhower had gone from being someone who felt we could work with the Soviet Union right after the war. In fact, in August 1945, there's a picture of Eisenhower literally standing next to Joseph Stalin at a reviewing stand above Lenin's tomb. And Eisenhower told the press during this goodwill trip to the Soviet capital that he saw no reason the Americans couldn't get along with the British with the Soviets in the same way they had with the British. He was very much the person who felt that the Allies could work together. Churchill, at that point, had gone deep into the Iron Curtain view. He saw the Red Army's conquest of massive areas of Central Europe, not just Eastern Europe, but Central Europe, such as Czechoslovakia. And he felt that the Americans had made a mistake in letting the Soviets get as far as they did and not driving as far east. Well, that was their view right after World War II, and Churchill only got harder over the next couple of years. He advocated, after his Iron Curtain speech, the American use of its atomic monopoly to blackmail Joseph Stalin into moving back toward the Russian frontiers. And he felt we should tell them, we will raise your cities, we'll blow them to pieces with our atomic arsenal if you don't move back. That was how virulently anti-communist Churchill was. And of course, he was one of the original anti-communists who wanted to strangle Bolshevism in its cradle. So two things changed in Churchill's mind. The first one was America's 1952 Ivy Mite test of a thermonuclear bomb. The thermonuclear weapons, as the audience may know, are many, many times more powerful than the atomic weapons used on Hiroshima. Our first test was the equivalent of about 700 Hiroshima bombs going off all at once. And Churchill, with his romantic, his artist, his writer's mind, with that fertile imagination of his, could easily see what a thermonuclear war, because we knew the Russians would get them sooner or later, what that war would do not only to the world, but specifically to Great Britain, and what a bomb dropped on London would do to his beloved homeland. And so because of the great danger of thermonuclear warfare and the death of Stalin in March of 1953, Churchill radically changed to become the great peace initiative man. He began pleading with Eisenhower to have a person-to-person summit with Stalin's successors. He liked to say that we can work these things out jaw to jaw. And he believed as an adherent of the great man theory of history, that when great men got together and talked, they could accomplish more in 3 days than 10,000 diplomats writing 10,000 memos could do. Eisenhower, for his part, shifted over to a high level of distrust of the Soviets. Even after Stalin's death, Eisenhower reasoned that governments are not made of people, the way Churchill felt. They're made of individuals who have jobs to do. They're made of functionaries. And if you take one functionary out, such as Stalin, then the next one, whether it's Malenkov or Beria or Molotov, is going to do basically what the predecessor did. And so Ike's distrust of the Soviet Union, deep in the middle of the McCarthy years, the Red Scare, and so on, led him to push, instead of détente, as Churchill suggested, to a line of hardened deterrence, mutually assured destruction, and a leading into the use of nuclear weapons to take the place of 4 million draftees, which America could not afford to keep up with. So this push and pull of détente and deterrence, one represented by Churchill, the other by Eisenhower, shaped the long peace that was the Cold War. And it shapes the relations between superpowers to this day. We still talk, but we still threaten.
How much of Ike and Churchill's success together was about personal chemistry versus shared strategic goals?
I think it was a little of both, Andy. It was a personal chemistry that exemplified one of the core requirements of the mission, which was unity among the Allies. With Eisenhower and Churchill, they both knew that they had to come across as being respectful and willing to listen to their allies. At one summit meeting between Churchill and FDR in 1943, on the ship over there, Churchill advised the Imperial Chiefs of Staff, basically the British version of the American Joint Chiefs, to go into any discussions, letting the Americans fully have their say. Don't cut off any discussion prematurely. Let them get it off their chests and listen to them. And that was his approach dealing with the larger American ally that he had to court. But that was also Eisenhower's approach. He wanted to make sure that the British understood he was not going to take his national prejudices along for the ride. And so many of Eisenhower's closest friends, like George Patton or Omar Bradley, felt that Eisenhower was too pro-British. He was too willing to bend over backwards and placate people like Bernard Montgomery or the British Prime Minister, whom they thought had this magical ability to weave a spell on Eisenhower. And Eisenhower was willing to take that heat from his American friends because the mission was so important and unity was such a core ingredient of their success.
What about humor? Did that play into their relationship much? And if so, do you have a favorite anecdote or two that would demonstrate that?
They both had a good sense of humor. Eisenhower liked to tell his son, John, take the job seriously. Don't take yourself too seriously. And one example of their ability to joke a little bit came at the very end of the December 1953 Bermuda Conference. That was a conference where Churchill was pleading with Eisenhower to go see the Soviets and negotiate with them. Eisenhower was refusing and wanted to go in a different direction. Well, at the very end of that conference, Eisenhower had to jet off to New York to speak before the United Nations. And they had to do a military review of the Welsh Guards. And the Welsh Guards had this beautiful large Kashmiri goat that was its mascot, named Willow or Willie or Billy Goat, effectively. And so Eisenhower and Churchill went down the long line of Welsh Guards who were standing at attention. And when Eisenhower got to the goat, he just casually asked the goat, "Would you like a cigarette?" And the goat said nothing. So Eisenhower got on the plane, he took off, and then he got a message through the British legation in New York when he arrived at the UN, or through the UN delegation, that it was from Churchill, and it said, "Dear Ike, I thought in explanation I should let you know that the reason the goat declined your offer of a cigarette is that he knew smoking is strictly prohibited on parade grounds." And Eisenhower wrote back to him, "You can imagine my embarrassment, imagine my shame. After 40 years in the Army, I'm embarrassed to have so badly embarrassed the goat. But the goat's military deportment puts me to shame." So they had a personal sense of humor. They genuinely liked each other. They obviously had so many shared years under the pressure cooker of World War II. But their personalities were such that they genuinely enjoyed each other's time. And so that's why in the later years, you see Eisenhower, President of the United States, kind of fawning for Churchill's company, especially when Churchill was in retirement, and then writing letters to him about their different painting projects. Churchill had been a famous painter, amateur painter, and when Eisenhower saw what kind of pleasure Churchill took from painting, Ike took up the paintbrush himself, and as a result, began an amateur painting career. And the portrait Eisenhower was most proud of painting was one of Churchill.
Let's jump ahead to today for a moment. How would you characterize the relationship between Donald Trump and Prime Minister Keir Starmer?
I can sort of talk about America and Britain generally. My day job is as a federal judge. So I'm a bankruptcy judge in Atlanta. And so while I can't get into too much about today's politics, I can sort of let you know, I can sort of say that the America and Britain of 2026 is much, much different from the America and Britain of, say, 1956. 70 years ago, you had Great Britain invading or going to war against a Middle Eastern country that was led by a hothead and a group of hotheads. The result of that was to shut down a strategic waterway, the Suez Canal. And at the time, America and Britain were close, and the Suez Crisis created a rupture in the Anglo-American relationship that both Eisenhower and Churchill in retirement worked very, very hard to stitch back together. 70 years later, we have kind of a similar thing, although obviously the war in Iran has got many differences and will probably play out differently. But the two countries are in a very different place than they were 70 years ago. And I think and that happened over time, and it's a natural function of economic horsepower, the American reserve currency, and a lot of other things. But I think that we've got just something that's very different that I would like to think Eisenhower and Churchill would have two thoughts on. One would be, I wish we were closer, but the other would be, I understand that the situation is different than it was 7 decades ago.
Mm-hmm. With regard to the quote unquote special relationship between the U.S. and the U.K., has it fundamentally changed, or is it just being tested in new ways?
You know, I heard someone say the other day that the special relationship was never really a relationship. It was always a deal. And it was a deal that worked out very well. And it was a deal that was accompanied by genuine good feelings and a common tongue and the ability to respect each other's cultures. We will always, I think, have a special relationship just because of our shared history during World War II, as well as from where the United States originated. But I think that as America goes through its sort of maturation phase as a superpower, it is something that we're always going to have some places where we differ from the British. It happened during Eisenhower's time. They had great disagreements over whether the U.S. should be involved in French Indochina or Vietnam, whether the United States should use atomic weapons in Korea, whether the British should take some actions against Egypt, and what we should do to keep. I think we were aligned on European issues, and that may be the big difference. Back then, we had the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact as our opponents. Now it's a little more muddled, and I guess when you're up close to a situation, it always appears more complicated than it does through the lens of history hindsight.
One of the big themes in your book is trust, obviously trust in particular between Ike and Churchill. There's a lot of people today who worry that that kind of trust from the UK to the United States, and with the United States and its other allies as well, that trust can't ever be, it's been lost and it can't ever be regained. What do you think about that?
Well, we've had differences over time, and these differences didn't occur overnight. Even back during Eisenhower's presidency, when the United States came down very hard on what was left of the British Empire. we basically used our economy as a weapon to force Britain, right after Churchill's resignation, to step back from any pretense it had of being a great power. And it sort of became an ordinary power that could do very little without the United States. That was a rupture. And at the time, it was such a bad breach of trust that cab drivers would order passengers to get out of their cabs in London when they heard American accents. The gas station attendants wouldn't serve Americans. There were a few American officers who were kicked out of their flats they were renting. It was that bitter. Then, of course, we had the work of later politicians like Harold Macmillan, later Prime Minister, and others who brought us closer together. Probably the most famous pairing was Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher in the early 1980s. These things come and go, and I suspect that as long as we do not have a common enemy to knit us together as closely as Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin did, we may have these differences will be probably more obvious, and that's where we probably are today. But we'll just have to see how the Chinese threat affects the Anglo-American relationship and whether we pull together closer. It will probably be with a combination of other allies at some point, but it's so hard to see how these things play out now. Mm-hmm. That's partly why I write about dead guys.
Yeah. Yeah. They can't surprise you anymore. And
we know how it turned out.
Yeah. Look, I'm not a spokesman for the Western world, but if I had to sort of characterize what they feel, the countries in the Western world feel, our allies feel about where we are today in America, you do have a president who attacks NATO, who is threatening to invade NATO countries, who is threatening genocide against the Iranian people, who cozies up to autocrats, who says he's in love with Kim Jong-un, et cetera. So it is different. I mean, I understand what you're saying about how we've always had our differences with any of our allies. But this stuff just seems bonkers. So if you are one of our allies, our NATO allies, it just seems like they can't look at the United States anymore and rely on America as this bedrock of democracy to protect and defend democracy all over the world. And I'm not even talking about the financial markets where we are a safe haven for all kinds of investments and stuff like that. So things just do seem different. That's why I ask, is it as simple as 2028, there's a new president, boom, we kind of go back to the way things were, and it's like, wow, that was a crazy ride? Or like in a marriage where there's an erosion of trust, can you really ever get that back?
My son is studying to be a diplomat. He'll be in Berlin next year. And when he was in Germany earlier, one of the things he told me was he was surprised about how large America looms in the life of Europe. And he said that in addition to the cultural things, he said that over in his part of Germany, where he was at least, the view was kind of, well, America is just there. It's like a mountain on the landscape. It does what it does. And, we all kind of go along. But he didn't remember the early 2000s. He was too young for that, when we had George W. Bush, and who replaced Bill Clinton. And then we had Barack Obama, who replaced George W. Bush. And I remember at the time, a lot of people saying in Europe, a lot of commentary that how does an America that votes for and reelects George W. Bush also turn around and vote for and reelect Barack Obama? It just seems like the pendulum is swinging wildly. And Bill Maher likes to say the pendulum never stops in the middle, as comfortable as that might be. But I don't know if the answer is in 2028, we'll have someone different. Wow, this was a crazy ride. Or what if that's the view. Um, but America has swung back and forth, and one of the strengths of our democracy is that we can change as the will of the people change, as their mood changes. But one of the weaknesses of democracy, of course, is that you don't have the continuity that you sometimes have in other systems of government. And I think most people would say, we'll take the schizophrenia of democracy over the steadiness of autocracy. But that's kind of above my pay grade in a lot of ways. But it is interesting to see how we have arguably less consistency, even though back during the Truman to Eisenhower transition, we did shift from a policy of containment to a policy of mutually assured destruction. And there are obviously, with the change of administrations, a lot of changes that began, and then they kind of hopefully gravitate to a happy medium. We'll see.
Yeah. Well, it's true what you're saying, and it's true what Bill Maher said. I mean, I personally think that the pendulum has swung so far in one direction that when it starts to swing back, it will probably swing so far in the other direction because people are just ready for that kind of change. Last question. After immersing yourself in all this history of Ike and Churchill, are you more optimistic or more concerned about the state of leadership and alliances today?
As far as leadership goes, I could see the argument that our leadership is a reflection of our social fabric. We had back in the World War II years when we, of course, had an existential threat, and it always helps to unite people behind an existential threat. We had people who would work together, and that social fabric went all the way up through the top. To give you an example, Winston Churchill's greatest political nemesis, the man who unseated him as prime minister in 1945, right after Churchill did so much to win World War II, was Labor Party leader Clement Attlee. And they were bitter political foes, but Attlee was one of the honorary pallbearers at Churchill's funeral. And Attlee and Churchill would meet for dinners. They were very respectful to each other, and they enjoyed each other's company. Eisenhower made a very strong effort to do that with pretty much everybody except Joe McCarthy. He would regularly meet with Sam Rayburn or Lyndon Johnson. He would regularly meet with Senator Taft of Ohio, who was the Republican hardliner who frustrated Eisenhower. But at the societal level, that ingrained willingness to be friends with people who disagree with you, the concept of just because you disagree with me on 30% of what I believe doesn't mean that we have to be enemies on 100%. We can find common ground. And so at a social level, when we lose some of that ability to break bread with our rivals, our political opponents, then that eventually gets reflected up into the higher levels. And I don't know how much of that we have to go before we come back to sort of a kinder, gentler approach.
Well, the book, again, is called Ike and Winston, World War, Cold War, and an Extraordinary Friendship. It's a fascinating subject. I hope you sell a lot of books. Congrats again.
Thanks so much, Andy. It's been terrific speaking with you.
Likewise. Take care. This episode was produced and edited by me, Andy Ostroy. It was co-produced by Maddie Rosenberg and Jen Hammoud for Radio Free Rhinecliff, with additional editing by Maddie Rosenberg, music by Andrew Hollander, and graphic design by Cricket Langell. And with a special thanks to our sponsor, The Epicurean. Again, thanks for listening. Please rate and review wherever you get your podcasts, and subscribe to the Backroom with Andy Ostroy YouTube channel, where you can watch full videos of our interviews. See you next time.